The state citizen is drawn into commerce when the birth certificate is registered and sent to the Commerce Department in Washington, D.C. This is where the American people became warehouse receipts upon which all of the money printed and circulated is created and guaranteed. In short, the American people became the collateral for all debts. They, quote unquote, the people, allegedly are government property. Government is a fiction and an artificial person and deals with us as a fiction or artificial persons only, as stated before. To take this still to another level, let's use an example to explain and use the name of John Henry Smith. When John Henry Smith was born, his parents gave him the Christian name of John Henry, and he shared the family name of Smith with all the other members of his family. He was born a living, breathing, sentient being. When his birth certificate was sent to the Department of Commerce, it was registered, and the government, because it was bankrupt, turned his real name into all capital letters name and registered it as a corporation at the Puerto Rico Department of State Corporations in Puerto Rico, thus making him, or it, liable for taxes. He is now a fiction or artificial person, a non-living, non-breathing person. It is a straw man. You know, the Latin is straminius homo, or fiction, upon which government brings all its so-called charges against, and never does so, against a real person. Just like yours, his driver's license now reads, all caps, John H. Smith, or uppercase John, uppercase H, dot, uppercase S. Smith. When he signs a 1040 tax form, he dutifully fills out the form as John H. Smith, and then he signs his name under penalty of perjury, thereby admitting he will be responsible for all the taxes of John H. Smith, a fiction in law, a corporation. Look at your driver's license and see who it is that they issued it to. How can government use a form of our name and turn it into a fiction corporation without our permission? They can't. We sign our name to all their forms, which is purely voluntary. It's permission in ignorance. In short, we do it ourselves. In the law, silence is acquiescence, and if you don't know your rights and you don't claim them, you don't have them. For those who wish to control and own this fiction and prohibit government corporations, including the Internal Revenue Service, from making so-called charges against it, the remedy is available to you. You do this by executing a UCC-1 financing statement. John Henry Smith would simply do what government and the Internal Revenue Service does not do. File your UCC-1 financing statement into the commercial registry with the Secretary of State and claim everything related to John H. Smith, or any derivative name, corporate fiction thereof. The birth certificate and Social Security account and card number is also claimed. The living, breathing, real man or woman then controls the fictitious entity, including all contracts related to the birth certificate and Social Security account number, UCC contract trust account number. Thusly, the real John Henry Smith secures all rights, interest, and title in the fictitious entity, John H. Smith. Now, the government and the Internal Revenue Service has to deal with John Henry Smith as the creditor. Most every living, breathing, sentient being has a Social Security card. The SS number is the account number to the UCC contract trust account, maintained through the U.S. Secretary of Treasury to the Internal Revenue Service. The Internal Revenue Service calls the Social Security number your Taxpayer Identification Number, or TIN. Never do they mention our Employer Identification Number, our EIN. You are not an employer, so you don't have an EIN, right? Some believe we are all employers and every one of us has an EIN. More recently, the number has been identified and clarified as an exemption number, indicating that the secured party holder is exempt from the liability. If you apply for a new Social Security card, not a new number, on the back side of the card, the number written in red is what some believe is the bond number to the bond account as established by the government upon your application. It is also believed that the government workers are our employees, that every government employee works for us. Since you are not a signatory to the U.S. or any state constitution, and since you are not a party to the states or the social compact, then you have nothing to do with the government corporation, and the government corporation has nothing to do with you. So it's actually absurd to think that. They are not our employees. They're a separate corporation. That is why when you read the tax code, define the definition of employee under Title 26 United States Code at Section 3401C. The term employee specifically includes officers and employees, whether elected or appointed of the United States, of state, federal, state, territory, or any other political subdivision thereof, or the District of Columbia, or any agency or instrumentality of any one or more of the foregoing, and nobody else. Write to the Bureau of Vital Statistics in the capital of the state where you're born and request a copy of your birth certificate. Request the long form certified copy. Never mind that you have a copy right now. More likely than not, it came from the county in which you were born. The number assigned to your birth certificate by the Vital Statistics Office is of primary importance when executing your UCC-1 financing statement. The usual and current birth certificate is in color on 81 by 2 by 11 bank stock paper. What can filing a UCC-1 financing statement do for you besides everything described so far? Let's throw a few more examples onto the table to explain. As previously stated, the only real thing in the United States is the American people. Corporations are fictions, dead entities. Let's use a fiction called General Motors for our explanation. Since the inception of General Motors, which was originally created by another corporate fiction we call the government, they have borrowed into existence countless billions of Federal Reserve notes. Today, General Motors proudly calls themselves one of the largest corporations, a fiction, in the world. It is taught that stockholders of General Motors own General Motors. The real truth is the American people own everything produced by General Motors, free and clear. Isn't it interesting this fiction charges the American people for what already belongs to us? And then to add more insult to injury, they tack on interest as well? When Internal Revenue sends a letter or notice to the fiction John H. Smith and says, our records indicate you owe $15,000. John Henry Smith, who has filed a UCC-1 financing statement, now has multiple options as to how he chooses to deal with this matter. John Henry Smith knows full well he must respond to the presentment he's just received from the Internal Revenue in a timely manner. Depending on the notice or presentment he's received, he has either 10 days or 30 to respond. If he does not know what his time frame is to respond, to play it safe, it would be better for him to respond within the 10 days. John Henry Smith knows that if he doesn't respond after the allotted time, the Internal Revenue Service will enter a default judgment against him. Because he failed to object to the bill or ask any questions about it, having defaulted, the amount can lawfully be collected from him. John Henry Smith also knows that he is not to protest or argue the amount of deficiency in any tax case. If you are not required to file, you should not care whether they say you owe $15,000 or $150 million. If you are not required to file, the amount is irrelevant. You never argue the amount because that is a fact issue. The reason for this is, usually when you receive a notice of deficiency, it is for some unworldly amount. The Internal Revenue Service wants you to run in and argue about the amount. The minute you say, I don't owe this much, you have just agreed that you owe something, and you concede a jurisdiction. One of the proper methods is to, as soon as possible, send a conditional acceptance for value for proof of claim to seek an agreement with the IRS in relation to certain points and facts, that all you can do is discharge the tax liability of your debtor strawman with bills of exchange. Some believe that John Henry Smith can exercise option 2 and can accept the $15,000 for value and return it for value, and the so-called debt is extinguished. While it sounds logical, we have seen no evidence that this process is honored. It may be possible because every real American has a corresponding offsetting credit for all debt claimed against his or her straw man. However, keep in mind when you do your chargeback, you charge up your UCC contract trust account so that you can use that credit to discharge fines, fees, taxes, etc. I also want to mention briefly that we'll be touching a little bit later on another podcast on MOSI, and it's mutual offset credit exemption exchange. It's different from a conditional acceptance for value, a CAFV, whereas the CAFV, as we just spoke on, is an accepting of the value, accepting something for value and discharging it. The mutual offset credit exemption exchange is using the credit exemption, the trust that's charged up in order to offset that debt as opposed to discharge it. So they're two separate processes. Moving on.